So as we continue to study the New Testament books, the New Testament letters, let's take a look at the social relationships within the communities and as they interact with the world around them. And so taking some of these letters as examples, let's see what we can learn from them. So sharing a PowerPoint here that hopefully will shed some light on these relationships. Let's take a look. And we're going to start with this idea of the Jesus community and the example that Jesus left for the Jesus community. And if you may remember, when we studied the Gospel of Luke, there was this time when Jesus went to the synagogue and it was his turn to read from the Hebrew scriptures. And so he read from the prophet Isaiah, and it's recorded in Luke chapter 4. And Jesus read, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free." And if you remember, Jesus after that sat down and said pretty much, hey, this is about me. So his choice there to reveal it is about him is very interesting, because this defines what the kingdom of God is all about. So that means that this affects social relationships, our interaction with the world around us. If Jesus came to bring good news to the poor, then so should the Jesus community, so should we. He preached release to the captives, the sense of justice, recovery of sight to those who have been blind, to bring freedom to those who feel oppressed. A little bit later, if you remember, John the Baptist sent his students over to Jesus to ask if he was the one that they were waiting for, the one that would bring restoration to the people. And instead of answering them directly, he said, well, go and tell John what you've seen and heard. And he repeats this idea of providing sight to blind people, healing in terms of the lame walking, lepers, people who were social outcasts being cleansed so they could be restored to the community, where deaf can hear, and even a time of revival, of new life, because deaf people are raised, and poor people, those who are socially kept from rising in the community, they have good news brought to them. And in a different occasion, a reference to Jesus is made. They refer to him as the Son of Man, which is this is a title that they ascribe to Jesus, but they refer to him as eating and drinking, and people talking about him as being a person who overeats, who is unpleasant, who is a drunk, so they're gossiping about him, and that he is a friend of people that people typically don't want to associate with. So that is socially invasive. Jesus seems to associate himself with people that the elite don't like. And so that's interesting for social relationships, right? So let's see by what we can learn about social relationships by looking at some letters that we find later on in the New Testament. One of them is the letter to the Philippians. So this is a group of believers in Philippi, that's in Macedonia. And it's a church that was started by the Apostle Paul. It's kind of a debate, like when he wrote this, but typically somewhere in the waning years of his ministry, somewhere in the early 60s. And it's written to Philippi. Well, not everybody agrees where he wrote this from. Is this from Ephesus? Is this from Ephesus? Is this from Rome? But the themes are very interesting. He writes about people getting along, unity, having humility. He emphasizes this Greek form of friendship and to be of good cheer while suffering. One of the things that the letter is known for is a hymn. He seems to quote songs that they would sing in the Christian gathering. And one of them is known as the Kenosis hymn. So remember, we had a song in Colossians. Now we have a song in Philippians. Philippians chapter 2 is actually talking about how Jesus humiliated himself, was humble, so that it kind of lays this foundation, this groundwork for social relationships within the community that can be seen outside of the community. If people just humble themselves, would be open to sometimes take some humiliation, then relationships can be mended. And so he says, be of the same mind that was in Christ Jesus. Why don't you have the same mindset? I mean, he was in the form of God before creation, but he did not use that. Instead, verse 7, he emptied himself when he became a baby. And it says, it uses interesting wording. It says, taken the form of a servant, of a slave, when he was born as a human. And being found in human form, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death. And the original language, the Greek says, even a cross-like death. And as a result, it says that God exalted him. And so he says, because of that, everyone worships him. It's very interesting, right? Notice this idea of emptying himself. This is why it has this name, kenosis him, because the Greek word there is this idea of kenosis, which means self-emptying. And that kind of took on a theological term. That's the way how people start to think about Jesus coming from this kind of like full defined form and coming to earth and being still fully God, but also being fully human. And it kind of sets up this paradigm of people emptying themselves so that social relationships have this definition of humbleness. And he says they're taking on the form of a slave because, as we learned when we looked at crucifixion, Jesus died by crucifixion, which was reserved for those lowest in society. Servants, slaves, people of very low socioeconomic bearing, and those who would rise up against the Romans, the oppressors. And so we see here that Jesus laid the foundation there of social equalness, okay? Well, then next, as the letter continues, Paul, the author, continues that thought of self-emptying, kenosis, because he says, hey, I was emptied out. And he uses kind of like this sacrificial sort of language that people are familiar with if they know the Hebrew Bible. He says, but even if I am being poured out as a libation, a particular kind of sacrifice, I am glad and rejoice with all of you. And there should not be a question mark there. But he says, I'm doing this. There's a song that we have that we sing about the fact that Jesus emptied himself. And then I, as a follower of Jesus, am doing this too. And then he kind of continues the letter and says, are you as well? Because based on this, we can interact with one another. This is our basis for social relationships. And then he gives a very practical example. He says, because more than me caring about my own background, and we have learned about Paul, right? He has quite an impressive background. He was trained under the best of the best rabbis, Rabbi Gamaliel. His parents at this point might have been well off. He had a respectful position in the city. He said, but more than that, I regard all of that stuff kind of lost. It doesn't count. Because knowing Jesus as the one that I follow is worth so much more. And he says, for his sake, I've suffered the loss of all things. He lost that position, And he says, I regard them as rubbish in order that I may gain Christ. I'm foremost a Jesus follower. So in most translations, that is actually translated as rubbish or garbage. But you see at the bottom here, that there is a Greek word here that we have translated as such. And if you pronounce that, it says skubala. This is an S kind of sound. Sku, this is a B-B-B-L, skubala. It's very interesting because Philippi was actually a big city. And Paul was actually a city slicker. And so Paul actually here speaks city talk. He's actually not saying rubbish. Even though we think he's kind of talking about garbage or rubbish. That's actually not what Paul is doing here. Paul actually is connecting here with kind of inner city folk. And I was born in the inner city. I was born in Amsterdam. Can you imagine? And so Paul actually here uses city slang. And he's actually dropping a little bomb here. And he says, compared to that, it's like a bomb. And I like the fact that Paul connects here with people. In fact, this is kind of a city that's connected very strongly to the main city of the Roman Empire, Rome. And Paul actually says that. He says, you know, you need to be thinking differently about this because our city here, Philippi, it's a Roman colony, but our actual citizenship, it's not about are you a citizen of Rome? Our actual citizenship is in the heavenly realm. And it's from there that we expect a Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ. Well, if you're a citizen of heaven, then why would you worry about your social relationships of earth? That's not the point. The point here is that Philippi was a colony of Rome, which meant they were supposed to make Rome shine to the world in a satellite city somewhere else. It's kind of like if you look to rent an apartment, sometimes there is an apartment that you can look at and see so you know what the other apartments look like. Or if you intend to purchase a home, there is one of those homes already built and there's an open house and you can visit that home. That's the idea here in Philippi. If you want to know what Rome looks like, you can walk through Philippi and it's mini Rome. So if you're citizens of that city, you are supposed to exhibit Rome. Well, Paul says we're not exhibiting Rome, we are exhibiting the heavenly realm. So you actually have a job to do on earth. When Paul says our citizenship is in heaven, it's not an escape clause. It doesn't mean tune out because we don't even belong here. No, that means we have a big job to do here, Jesus followers. We're supposed to represent God's heavenly realm here on earth. Our social relationships, how we treat one another, the example that we have seen in Jesus, it should shine because we should show people what the big city is all about by living our lives here. We have a job to do here. If you're a Jesus follower, then every morning you get up, you have a job to do. In fact, that's what comes up in chapter 4. Apparently, some people need to be reminded to be of the same mind. I urged Euodia and Syntyche, 2 women who were actually leaders in the church. They had a lot of female leaders. And he says, you know, get together. I need you to encourage them, tell them to be of the same mind, just like in that song. And I need you to be joyful, rejoice in the Lord always. Let your gentleness be known to everyone. To all the people in the surrounding area, be known as gentle people. Interesting, right? Okay, and so next, the letter to Philemon. So next, let's look at the letter to Philemon, which specifically deals with social relations. So Philemon is a very brief letter. People agree that Paul wrote it, and it addresses 3 different key people, kind of all interconnected in the situation. So Paul is involved because he writes the letter. He writes it to Philemon, but it's actually about a runaway slave called Onesimus. So here's the situation, right? Paul was faced, in essence, with 2 estranged Christians. Both are Jesus followers. Philemon is a Jesus follower, and Onesimus is a Jesus follower. And here's another complication. It sounds like both these men had become Jesus followers because Paul told them about Jesus. And Paul really liked Onesimus. So whether Paul is in Ephesus in prison or he's in prison in Rome, Onesimus is near him. And he really enjoyed the company of Onesimus. But this is challenging in terms of social relationships, because out in culture, you would have different stratification here, right? Philemon is the master and Onesimus is the servant. And Onesimus would have a problem here because Philemon has rights. He has ownership rights. In the Christian community, however, as brothers in Christ, they're equals. So what is supposed to happen? Let's talk a little bit about slavery in the Greco-Roman world. And what you see here is a little metal tag that was worn around the ankle most of the time. which pretty much talked about if you ever find this person, return to owner. Now, there's different beliefs about slavery in the New Testament era. Now, often it's emphasized that, it wasn't as bad as slavery during the colonial era, because often slaves were treated better. After all, you would find slaves in the upper echelons of society, people who would ride, people who would embody certain upper class jobs. But let's look at a couple of things that also are true. Basically, people were captured in war. We see this in the Hebrew Bible as well. When one group conquered another people, then the other people served them. And so then people would be slaves who were descendants of these people that were captured in war. And that could be anyone, right? Sometimes people were sold into slavery to pay a debt. They could sell themselves, they could sell their children. Other people who would end up as servants, as slaves, were people who were abandoned as infants. And then people would pick them up and they were raised, being owned by other people. This is one that we tend to think of, and that's people who were captured by people, just caught and then sold by slavers, people who legitimately went out to hunt people down. This is interesting. Slaves had no legal rights to marry. So that's restricting a person. And no matter how nice people were treated and what kind of higher socioeconomic strata they could sometimes even appear to walk in, when certain basic human rights are denied, is a person really free? I find this especially bothersome. Male slaves did not have parental rights. And I want to give you a moment to think about the question, why? Why do you think male slaves did not have parental rights? Well, think about it. Oftentimes, the women were impregnated by their masters. Also, it would leave ownership with the owners. So imagine not being able to be the father of your own child if you fathered that child. That's just, again, basic human rights taken away. It goes to dignity as well. And in the time of Augustus and beyond, so during the time of the Roman Empire, members of the senatorial class were prohibited from marrying freed slaves. So people could sometimes work out deals, right, where you could work off the cost of you, and you could be working up to your freedom. But even if you were freed, you were still not equal to other people in society, because the people of the upper social classes actually could not marry those people. So you never had equal rights of dignity. But fact remains that almost every free person owned at least a slave, at least one slave. And in some of the Greek writings, and Aristotle talks about it, it's talked about as having a daily companion. For some people, those were their friends. It prohibited loneliness. So we have kind of like these conflicting sort of languages, right? But there's also a counter side. Male and female slaves simply owed their owners sexual favors at any time. So again, and I apologize if this is triggering you or people that you love. Anytime that people don't have saying power over their own body, do not have the ability to consent, it goes against basic human rights, does it not? Even worse so, female slaves are basically used for breeding. They basically were supposed to come up with more slaves so that they can be sold for profit. So they often opted for abortions and were put at risk while giving birth, because that's what's a high risk event for females. So before people make blanket statements how it was different from slavery in the colonial era, this is tough. Okay, so the subject matter that we encounter in the New Testament is tough. In fact, in a letter later on in 1 Timothy, it's actually recognized Slave traders are mentioned, and they're mentioned as people who are very poor character. So we already start seeing that the Christian communities do not condone these people. So we start seeing change. We start seeing that they're standing up against it. But you could say, why did they not stand up sooner and faster? So the real issue in this letter of Philemon is not necessarily, what's really going on between Paul and Onesimus and Philemon. No, the real issue is, what does it take to really live out the principles of Jesus? Remember, we talked about Jesus in terms of kingdom values. What did the real community look like? Well, now it becomes an issue of, how do you put Jesus' type of living into practice when they face societal challenges? Social relationships were a real big challenge. And it looks like it has to be changed from the inside out. Outside, people had slaves. And lots of people who came into the Christian community, they were slaveholders or they were slaves themselves. And they were trying to come up with a way of living where everyone could be inside that community. So a letter is sent to Philemon by Paul to take Onesimus back, but not just as a former slave or as a slave, but as a brother in Christ, as an equal. And what does that look like? I mean, it's one thing to take a person back, but could Onesimus, who has been under the tutelage, under the training of Paul, become the next preacher in the church that Philemon has? Would he be able to lead the people? What does it really look like? What does it look like for us? So often we have ideals, but do we really put it into practice? Do our ideals really affect how we live our lives? That's the real issue. And where does change start? Does it start by posting things on our social media, or does it start with how we treat people every day, the way we act around people when people don't see us? It's interesting, right? Changing society from the inside. What about other types of social relationships? What about women in the New Testament world? Well, it's a patriarchal world. It was run by men. And especially in the Jewish side of it, women definitely didn't have much of a say. And on the Roman end of it, women started to emancipate just a little. And we know that women were the witnesses to Jesus' resurrection. When we go further around the Mediterranean, as the Jesus communities develop, we start seeing the influence of women in these Christian communities. This is the end of the letter to the Romans, chapter 16, and we encounter a female deacon. I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon in the church. And if you look at that first Greek word here that is read, you can actually sound that out. This is a D sound. And then these V-looking letters, they actually have an N sound. So it says diakonon. So yes, it says a diakonon of the church at Cancria. Some translations will say a minister or a servant, but it really says deacon. It's very interesting. And when it concerns male deacons, it translates it in some translations as deacons. But when it's a woman, we don't like to translate deacon. Well, we should. It says deacon. And deacon is a type of leader in the church. So we have a sister, Phoebe, who is a leader in the church. And he says she's been a benefactor at prostasis. She really has been a supporter of the church. And a lot of people think that she's actually the one that brings this letter to the church. So what about female leaders in the early church? Well, here's a selection. Again, the top box here is from Romans chapter 16. That's a long goodbye sort of chapter by Paul. He writes to the church in Rome. And he drops a lot of names. But look at these red names here. Those are all female names. Now, clearly, there are more male names, which you would expect in a primarily patriarchal sort of world. But that's a lot of females being mentioned. So Paul wrote many other letters, right? And is often accused or talked about as a person who may not like women because he says a lot of different kind of things. And then there are other letters by Paul and people in the Pauline community. And notice that more women are talked about. Nympha and has a church in her home, Euodia and Syntyche. Here's Claudia, Aphia, our sister. These are some other letters by Paul. Look at all these red names. So if this guy Paul really did not like women, then why are all these women positively commenting on his social media posts and other people are saying that they are leaders in his churches? See, that doesn't add up. It really looks like people are positively engaged in ministry and they're female. So sometimes you can say one thing about a person, but then you check their social media and it really seems like he has supporters and they're friendly and he knows them and they encourage him and he's interacting with them. So rather than looking at Bible verses and throwing them at each other, what sometimes happens in churches and Bible studies, and we say, what about what this person says here? Well, what about what this person says there? Why don't we just check their social media posts and see who are in it and what they say? And when you check Paul's social media, it looks like he has a lot of female acquaintances and friends, and they are leaders in the churches. Well, tells me enough about how Paul felt about leadership among women. And that's important, okay, because we have a lot of women on planet Earth. Half the people on this earth are women. We have almost 8 billion people on this earth, and half of them, almost 4 billion people, actually slightly more than half, are women. So for some of you who grew up with Christianity or are churchgoers, and for some of you who go to churches where they say, women cannot be leaders, women cannot be pastors, there really are not a whole lot of Bible verses about it, and nothing that clearly says that, nor are there clearly verses that talk about man pastors. I want you to think about this. This is a strong statement that pertains to over 4 billion or about 4 billion people on this planet. So whatever we believe affects 4 billion people on this. Do we really want to carry that responsibility? I used to be very careful teaching about this until one day it dawned on me. Look at the number. What if you get it wrong? Wouldn't you rather err on the side of encouraging God's creation? Here's the world population clock. You can click on it and it will take you to a website that shows you the population in the world. And I'm not sure if at this point, if I stop sharing it. So let me go out of the sharing part here and I will share a website that shows you the world population clock. So here we go. Look, the current world population. It shows you how many people are born today, how many deaths. So you see that the births outnumber the deaths. Look at that. And we're steadily aiming at 8 billion people, and more than half of them are female. We don't have time to talk about silliness that women cannot have leading roles. If we're going to share the Jesus story, we need everyone on board, and we better support women. So let me go back to our PowerPoint for just a moment as we finish this presentation. Okay, so back here, this is where we were, and you can check the world population clock anytime. And there's some very interesting letters later on, like in 1 Timothy, right? Some of these disputed letters of Paul. Yeah, there are some difficult verses here, like this one here. This is somebody in the Paul group, probably one of the students, that says, I desire when y'all come together that women should dress themselves modestly, says something about their hair and about the pearls that they clothe. And in verse 11, let a woman learn in silence with full submission. I permit no woman to teach. So I guess you got to turn off this video because, I'm a woman and I'm teaching. or to have authority over man. She's to keep silent. And then it goes back to Adam and Eve. And then look at verse 15. She will be saved through childbearing. Can we just agree that this is at the very least difficult to read or difficult to interpret? So I have 4 children, but I know plenty of people who have fertility problems that would love to bear a child, but are incapable. Now, this would be cruel if this indeed is a prerequisite to get right with the Lord, that you have to bear a child as a woman to get right with the Lord. So people then quickly go like, no, this is not what it means, and explain it away. Remember prescriptive and descriptive? Oh, so verse 15 then is taken descriptively. It actually means something else, like they're nurturers or the children's workers. But then they take verse 12 prescriptively. Women cannot teach men. Wait, so between verse 12 and verse 15, you change the way you read things. We talked about that, right? Look at how this works out. When you start this particular part in this letter, it actually starts out with who God is. There's one God. There's also one person in between, Jesus Christ, who gave himself a ransom for all. Therefore, and then he has instructions for men and instructions for women. This is sent to a place that's trying to work with social relationships in the culture. And he actually has instructions for the men and instructions for the women. And then it ends with this kind of sentence about that women should be bearing children in order to get saved. And look how you have these instructions per gender. For the man, it says, I desire then that in every place men should pray, lifting up holy hands without anger or argument. And then what we saw for the women. So if this is to guide social relationships in churches, we have a problem here, right? Because look at the inference here. If in the pink part here, if we think it guides female behavior, right? If a woman is to learn silence, and sometimes people say like, well, it's because they are talkative and whatever. Okay, so if we extract information about functioning of women here and say, well, that's the way God designed it, we ought to do the same thing for the blue box, right? Man, okay. So that would mean that if I come to a church that's implementing this, that when I walk in, I should see the men praying with their hands lifted up, and somehow the hands are holy. Without argument or anger. Wait, does that insinuate that men tend to be angry easily and easily get into arguments? And then we somehow start reasoning backwards, like, well, men have more testosterone, so maybe that makes them more prone to arguments and to anger. Can I just confess to you that I'm uncomfortable with that I'm uncomfortable with this idea of rendering men as kind of like uncontrolled beings who have anger issues. I'm married and I have a son, and I find it difficult to read things like that and to say that they are angry beings who easily get angry and get into arguments just because of that. This is not a way to deal with this kind of way. How about this? How about we look at it descriptively, right? And we are versatile with this now. What about we look at a letter like this and we see this community writing to a group of people. It's in Ephesus. There's something going on. They are occasional documents. It's written to this place for a specific reason about a specific issue that calls for helping with social relationships. So there are specific guidance for men and women based on what's going on socially in that location. And we don't always know exactly what's going on, right? But at the end of the day, the aim is to share the love of God with people in culture so as to guide social relationships, rather than using it as a how-to book. How about that? And I like that. Because we see that Jesus broke through gender obstacles, right? Remember Jesus' treatment of women. He treated them as equal. Remember Mary of Bethany, who sat at Jesus' feet and was taught the way men were taught. Remember that the Gospels have female witnesses at the resurrection, and they became the first preachers. Remember this list of female leaders in the early churches and Paul's co-workers and all that. This is no coincidence. This is the sign.